It's further proof of how perverted he is. But the man we now know is the Claremont serial killer used to call himself the Bogeyman to people he met online. On Thursday, Bradley Robert Edwards was found guilty of murdering 2 young women in the mid-1990s. The judge at his trial said it was likely he also killed a 3rd woman, but because her body was never found, there wasn't enough evidence for a conviction. Notwithstanding that setback, the verdict ends more than 2 decades of fear in Perth. But before Edwards began his killing spree, he attacked numerous other women. One of them is speaking publicly for the first time tonight and asking a very uncomfortable question. If her case had been investigated more seriously, could Edwards' evil have been stopped much sooner? Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. 2 beautiful young lives so brutally ended by serial killer Bradley Edwards, who was also charged with the murder of Sarah Spiers. And there were other victims, women who somehow survived. Wendy Davis is one. She fought for her life after Edwards attacked her in 1990. Wendy, you're the victim of a serial killer who has lived to tell the tale. How does that sit with you?
Not easily, Liam. But I feel very, very, very blessed and very grateful that I'm actually here to tell the story.
Wendy Davis now lives a world away from Perth, with husband Tim and dog Maisie in a glorious part of Tasmania. Tonight, she's telling her story for the first time. A story of how a killer could have been stopped in his tracks before the murders started. Why have you chosen to speak out now about this, to relive this terrible ordeal?
This hasn't been an easy decision for me to do this. I'm a very private person, but I wanted to have the opportunity to tell my part in this terrible, terrible story in my own words.
And I know this sounds silly in one regard, but you are one of the lucky ones, aren't you?
Oh, yes. Yep. Yep. I was very lucky. I was very lucky.
Today's discovery confirms Perth's worst fears. Another young girl murdered, a serial killer amongst us.
It's impossible to understate the impact Edwards' crimes had on Perth in the 1990s. Targeting young single women in the upmarket suburb of Claremont after they had been on a night out. He would kindly offer them a lift home in his Telstra station wagon before murdering the girls and dumping their bodies in isolated bushland.
Photographic evidence of the shallow grave was taken. Police divers arrived to search the nearby swamp.
There was a monster at large. The equivalent would be, I guess, Ivan Milat driving around, Double Bay or Toorak in a Telstra car, picking up, single young women walking the streets.
I mean, it really changed this area, didn't it? It used to be a bustling place for young people to come to. It completely altered that.
Exactly. It became rigid with fear, this town. You could almost smell the fear when first 1, then 2, then 3 young women went missing.
Brett Christian is the owner and publisher of the local Claremont newspaper, The Post. The abductions and murders happened on his beat. No one has followed this story more forensically over the past 25 years.
You come here during the day and you'd have no idea that this was a place of horror, really. It became that in people's minds.
So these streets here were the hunting ground for the killer. That's not putting it too harshly.
Exactly. You know, he was a predator. He prowled the area looking for prey and found it.
Bradley Edwards grew up on the other side of Perth from Claremont in the suburb of Huntingdale. He and his family have long since moved on, but it was from this house a teenage Edwards began his prowling habits. From here, at night time, he became a burglar, a peeping Tom, and on at least one occasion, a sexual offender. In 1988, he was responsible for a string of offences around nearby homes. Police collected fingerprints, even DNA from clothing left behind, but they simply couldn't catch him. Then, 2 years later, he chose a very different location to attack another victim in broad daylight. In 1990, Wendy Davis worked as a senior social worker in the palliative care unit of Hollywood Hospital in the Perth suburb of Nedlands.
I thought I'd found my vocation. I loved my job. We worked with the doctors and the nurses to provide end-of-life care for patients who were dying. Yep.
At the time of the attack, Wendy was a 40-year-old mother of three. And Edwards, a 21-year-old employee of Telecom, now known as Telstra. Around mid-afternoon, May the 7th, 1990, Wendy was at her desk, immersed in her work.
I can remember what I was doing because it was my youngest daughter's 11th birthday, and I was hurrying to get this report done so that I could get home at a reasonable hour. And a voice said, is it okay if I use the toilet?
Is it okay if I use the toilet?
And I was on one of those swivel chairs on wheels, and I turned round and I saw that it was a Telstra worker. He must have had some identification or uniform, and I didn't really look at him. I was vaguely aware of him going behind me to go into the toilet. When I heard the toilet flush, he hadn't been in there long enough to go to the toilet. But just as I was thinking those things, a hand came from behind me with a cloth on it round my face. Another hand came round behind me and grabbed me and hoiked me up back off my chair and started to drag me towards the toilet area and the utility room. And I was absolutely petrified. I thought there was something on the cloth, and I thought I was going to die. I thought the force with which he did it was so frightening. I was so scared. I couldn't breathe. Eventually I had to breathe in because I was starting to choke and the cloth was being pushed further and further into my mouth. So I breathed in and I realised that I was still all right, that there was nothing on the cloth. I thought that, and that's when I really started to struggle. I somehow managed to twist around and I kicked out with my legs. And the next minute, he just stopped, and it all just stopped, and I fell away and I looked at him, and it was the weirdest feeling because he had this strange look in his eye, like he was completely disassociated. And he shook his head and he started to say, I'm sorry.
Hospital security quickly apprehended Edwards, and along with the gag, police discovered cable ties in his pockets. Wendy is convinced he was planning to sexually assault her.
He was actually going to rape me, to molest me. There was no other reason that he would be dragging me back into the toilet.
It really turned out to be ground zero in this case, didn't it?
It was. Yeah, it's a good description. Ground zero. God knows what would have happened had she not had the strength to kick free. He'd pinned one of her arms, but you really got to give it to her. She really fought for her life. She thought she was going to be killed. And I think it's quite possible she would have been.
He has cable ties on him
That's right.
and is prepared to use a gag and, as you say, physical force.
Yeah. And he'd scoped out the toilets beforehand and he was dragging her towards them. So what could have happened to her in there, doesn't bear thinking about.
It's incredible to think that all those years they were hunting this Claremont serial killer, and here you are, unknowingly of course, having a first-hand eyewitness experience with him.
Yeah.
It's chilling, isn't it?
It's terrifying, really, to think that.
Coming up, why wasn't he treated as a sexual offender?
I have absolutely no idea.
Not taken seriously.
I'd be furious.
Did a lack of police action
No wonder he thought he was bulletproof.
and a slap on the wrist, how in the heck did he get to keep his job at Telstra?
That's a great mystery.
Help make a monster. If police had treated Edward's attack on you properly, do you think he would have gone on to become a killer? That's next on 60 Minutes.
A 48-year-old man is behind bars tonight, charged with the murders of Kira Glennon and Jane Rimmer.
The Claremont killer, Bradley Edwards, was arrested in December 2016 after the longest manhunt in Australian criminal history. For Wendy Davis, this news brought back long-suppressed traumatic memories and also anger. She believes Edward's attack on her in 1990 was never properly dealt with by police. And if it was, it could have saved lives.
I absolutely believe that the fact that Bradley Edwards was not charged with a more significant crime effectively left him off the police radar.
But he would have been on their radar, Wendy, if they had done their job properly in addressing his attack on you.
Yes, that's right.
You were the dress rehearsal for him, weren't you?
Yes, I absolutely believe that he was practicing.
Edwards attacked Wendy while she was working at Hollywood Hospital and attempted to drag her into a nearby bathroom. After the police took your statement and obviously talked to him, what was he charged with?
He was charged with common assault.
Just common assault. Common assault is a charge that could be levelled at somebody swearing at somebody across the street.
Yeah,
Not trying to drag them into a toilet with a
That's
rag
right.
over their mouth and cable ties in your back pocket.
that's right.
Why wasn't he treated as a sexual offender?
I have absolutely no idea, and I didn't know until it came out at the trial that he'd actually been referred to a sexual offenders program. I didn't know that.
I'd be furious if I was her. I mean, at the very least, it was deprivation of liberty and, potentially a sexual assault. And the extraordinary thing about it was that the magistrate recognised it, and he ordered that Edwards undergo sexual counselling. In fact, he ordered a sexual offenders program for him, which lasted 8 months.
So even the magistrate got it, that it was a sexually motivated attack.
Sure did.
Edwards pleaded guilty, but only received 2 years probation. Author Brett Christian believes this slap on the wrist empowered a young assailant onto a deadly path. Not treating him as a sex offender at that time, at that instant, what difference did that make to him?
I think his life could have taken a much different path had that crime being treated a lot more seriously at the time.
When Edwards attacked Wendy Davis here at Hollywood Hospital, his family home was still in Huntingdale. That's the same suburb where a string of sex-related assaults and burglaries remained on police file waiting to be solved. But inexplicably, not one police officer investigated any link between Edwards' vicious attack here and unsolved crimes in his own backyard. Is it melodramatic to say that if he had have been treated as a sex offender, the crime had have been treated properly in 1990, that Kira and Jane and Sarah could be alive today?
I think that's very possible, yeah. You can't say for sure, but it's likely.
This is a tough question. If police had treated Edwards' attack on you properly, do you think he would have gone on to become a killer?
I've thought about that many times and wondered if I could have done anything else at the time that may have altered the charge. But I did the very best I could, and the police force were not listening, and Telstra Telecom, as it was certainly not listening to what I was saying about the attack at the time.
Wendy maintains Edwards' bosses at Telstra didn't take the attack seriously either. Indeed, a company rep met with Wendy to vouch for his character.
During that meeting where the Telstra manager was actually advocating so strongly for his employee, he actually referred to Bradley Edwards as young Bradley.
Young Bradley.
And that's always stuck in my mind as well. He referred to him as young Bradley. The other thing that he said was he was very stressed, that he was having personal relationship problems, and he just snapped. And when he'd attacked me, he just snapped. And my response to that was, well, it's not normal behaviour for somebody with relationship problems to attack a vulnerable person that they don't even know.
But if they had been listening properly, if they had just done their job properly, and he had been punished appropriately and lost his job accordingly, it may have changed everything.
It may have changed everything, yes.
How in the heck did he get to keep his job at Telstra?
That's a great mystery. I can't fathom it. You imagine someone attacking a client of your employer while you're on the job, and they say, oh, by the way, you just keep your job. And you got a promotion and a pay rise, in a year or so later.
But just carry on.
Just carry on, yeah. No wonder he thought he was bulletproof.
Edwards got off virtually scot-free after his attack on Wendy Davis. It was a critical stage in the making of a monster. To the police, Edwards was a young bloke with a minor assault charge, not a sexual predator on a lethal path.
If the police had just looked a little further into the attack on me, they would have seen that he lived in Huntingdale, where only 18 months or so before there had been a series of attacks where his fingerprints were actually already on record. They would have seen that if they just looked into the attack on me a little bit further.
And it would have changed the course of his life and, dare I say, Kira Glennon, Sarah Spears and Jane Rimmer.
Yes.
When you look at the facts, the cold hard facts, that's exactly the case.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Coming up,
Everything came flooding back to me.
reliving a nightmare 30 years on.
Just looked exactly the same, just older, fatter.
And you admit that that was bad policing. Criticism? What criticism?
18,000 suspects. We've never had a case like it.
The top brass defend their investigation. At least you did play a role in identifying him.
Too late though, Liam.
That's next on 60 Minutes. In less than 10 years, Bradley Edwards morphed from a suburban peeping Tom to a rapist and then a serial killer. Yet, throughout his reign of terror and the decades that followed until his arrest in 2016, he remained hidden in plain sight. He had a good job, got married a couple of times, played local footy, and was even president of a little athletics club. A regular, civic-minded bloke. But author Brett Christian knows Edwards was anything but. He liked to call himself the bogeyman.
The bogeyman, yeah.
Does that tell us anything?
That's really, really creepy, isn't it? Yeah, that is creepy. I mean, the bogeyman is what he was.
After attacking Wendy Davis in 1990, the bogeyman didn't strike again for another 5 years. Then, in 1995, Edwards abducted, bound, gagged, and raped a 17-year-old girl multiple times in the Karrakatta Cemetery. The girl had been walking home after a night out in nearby Claremont. She survived, but soon all of Perth would be terrorised.
I can't see any reason why she wouldn't be with us if she could be with us. There must be something more to it.
First, 18-year-old Sarah Spears vanished after a night out in Claremont on Australia Day 1996. Her body was never found.
A mother and her 2 children making the gruesome find.
Then, in August 1996, the remains of 23-year-old Jane Rimmer were discovered 2 months after she went missing.
3.5 hours after the body had been found.
Finally, in April 1997, the body of young lawyer Ciara Glennon, who had travelled back to Perth for her sister's wedding, was found in another bush grave.
Only now do I even begin to understand the terrible trauma that the parents of Jane and Sarah went through.
When Ciara was deemed a missing person, I appealed for help to find her in a press conference like this, in this very same room.
It would take 23 excruciating years for Dennis Glennon to finally discover who killed his daughter, and he has nothing but praise for the efforts of WA's police force.
The WA police force deserve a special thank you. They permitted me to enter their world and express my profound desire for justice.
This is an investigation not only spanning decades, but this struck fear into the heart of all West Australians. We knew we were hunting a serial killer.
Chris Dawson is WA's police commissioner, proud that his force finally delivered. From a policing perspective, from your side of the fence, what was the pressure like to find this bloke?
We've never had a case like it, and one would hope that we will never have to endure anything of that scale. It's a staggering number of suspects and persons that were identified. We went through 18,000 nominated people and or suspects that police developed themselves. And ironically, well, it's more than ironic, Bradley Edwards was never nominated.
He was never one of those 18,000 on the list?
No, he was not.
Never came up?
No.
But the fact that Edwards evaded capture for so long raises questions not about police effort, but execution. This bloke, from 1988, for 10 years that we know, was attacking, assaulting,
raping and murdering for 10 years, and yet he was never even a suspect. How is that possible, and how is that anywhere near good police work?
Because you're being very selective. Not every offence gets solved.
In 1990, he is a bloke who attacked someone at Hollywood Hospital in a sexually motivated way.
Mm-hmm.
That night of his arrest, he goes home to stay with mum and dad in Huntingdale, where 18 months previously there's this string of unsolved crimes, as you've acknowledged. And yet no policeman on the beat puts two and two together and at least does a search.
I don't think you appreciate that the systems were simply not as integrated then as they are now. And yet, if I mention that there were 27,000 exhibits, if I've already mentioned there were 18,000 suspects, if I mentioned that there were 3,000 witness statements.
It's true that this was an incredibly complex and demanding case. But it's also true police didn't realise the most vital clues were gathering dust on their evidence shelves. Matching blue polyester fibres, later revealed to be from Telstra work pants, were found in the hair of both Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. Grey seat fibres from a Commodore station wagon were also found on both girls. And it took 11 years until the fingernail scrapings of Kira Glennon were properly analysed and finally produced the killer's DNA.
And when they did test it, they took the sample to England, and when it was tested, bingo, they got a hit.
That hit linked Kira's killer with the unknown Karrakatta rapist. So they finally had the DNA match, but still no name. 7 years later, in 2016, police discovered another DNA match and also fingerprints left behind in a Huntingdale sexual assault in 1988. And guess who those fingerprints belonged to? It was the hand of the young Telstra worker who attacked Wendy Davis at Hollywood Hospital. Police had their killer, Bradley Edwards.
How momentous was that?
That was probably the critical moment where the investigators then knew that they were on the pathway to the person who ultimately is now found as the Claremont serial killer.
Back in Tasmania, the arrest of Edwards stirred awful memories of the attack and its aftermath for Wendy Davis.
Even now, I feel very, very, very guilty that I didn't make more of a fuss at the time that the attack happened.
Wendy, you can't feel guilty. I mean, you were the victim. That's not fair.
But I do. I did my best, but I felt powerless. I felt as though nobody was listening to what I was saying. I felt as though it was all taken completely out of my hands.
The attack on Wendy Davis in 1990. How can you explain how it was that Edwards was treated so lightly?
Look, I'm well aware that the offence for which Bradley was convicted of was that of assault, indeed, common assault.
Common assault?
Yeah.
How the hell can that happen?
I've looked at that. I was not the investigating officer or the arresting officer. I believe other charges could have been preferred, including depriving her of her liberty, for instance. The manner in which he did that. Had that offence been one of a sexual nature in our systems, I don't have any difficulty in saying it would have escalated it on the radar. Now,
it would have and could have quite possibly changed the course of the entire case. You admit that that was bad policing.
I'm saying that had that offence characterised this person as a sex offender, a motivated sex offender,
which
it may well have then escalated this person. It might be a surprise to you, Liam, that there are 2,000 or 3,000 very perverted offenders who live in the city of Perth.
Last December, Wendy Davis was asked to confront this pervert again. She agreed to fly back to Perth to face a much older Bradley Edwards in court.
I was terrified when I went in, but the way that I dealt with it was not to focus on Bradley Edwards. I just focused completely on the prosecutor and just told my story. It's something that you don't forget. It was so terrifying.
When you looked at his face, Wendy, did it all come back to you then?
Oh, absolutely. Everything came flooding back to me. He just looked exactly the same, just older and you know, fatter, bigger, just larger, but exactly the same. The same hair. It was exactly the same.
I am satisfied, beyond reasonable doubt, that the accused was the killer of Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon.
3 days ago, Justice Stephen Hall found Wendy's attacker, Bradley Edwards, guilty of murdering Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, and most likely Sarah Spears. It brings an end to one of the most extraordinary chapters in Australian criminal history.
I think you get some closure, but it's always going to be the same. No one's ever going to bring it back.
For Wendy Davis, justice has been a long time coming, and she is now writing her own book. It's a form of therapy and a way of excising her demons. The attack on you was really the cornerstone of this whole case. It came right back to that, didn't it? That's how police learnt his identity, because he had to plead guilty to that very superficial charge of common assault against you.
Yes. Yes. That's right.
So Wendy, at least you did play a role in identifying him in the end.
Too late though, Liam. Too late. Very, very, very sad story.
Hello, I'm Liam Bartlett. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.